Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into writing your book, Plato and the Talmud, and also a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. First, I'd like to say that I'm really glad to be on this podcast. I think this is going to be a really fun and interesting discussion. My scholarly background was in Plato. And before I wrote this book on Plato and the Talmud, I had written 3 other books, all having to do with Plato. One was on Plato's Republic, comparing it sort of to the Odyssey and presenting as a kind of Odyssey of philosophy. Another was on a sequence of dialogues in Plato, the Theaetetus, Sophist, and Statesman, where Socrates undergoes, at the same time as his public trial, when he's being tried by the Athenians for impiety and corrupting the young, he undergoes a kind of philosophical trial that's conducted by a stranger, a philosophical stranger from a place called Elia. And then I wrote a book on Kierkegaard and Socrates because later philosophers love Socrates, and they all have their own version of Socrates. And Kierkegaard considered himself a kind of Christian Socrates. So I had already sort of dealt with comparing a sort of Christian perspective with a Socratic perspective and seeing what that generated. And I realized it's actually very interesting to bring different traditions into connection with each other, because you can find similarities and you can find differences, and fundamental questions, I think, become illuminated that way. So then I belonged to a conservative congregation in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and around 1998, our rabbi said, hey, we're going to begin Talmud studies. And I hadn't studied the Talmud before. So I start reading the Talmud. I think we began with some stuff in Bava Metzia, and then we turned to Ta'anit, and then we did some stuff from Sanhedrin. And I thought, this stuff is really familiar, because if your listeners have read Plato, they know that we have these things called dialogues, which are really philosophical dramas. And in these philosophical dramas, most often the character of Socrates appears. Socrates was the teacher of Plato. And there are discussions and debates. Some of them grow a little bit rancorous occasionally, but most of the time they're not. About fundamental issues like how to live, what is justice, what is piety, and so forth. And the dialogues often do not reach resolution. So they'll discuss a topic. There's a wonderful dialogue called the Laches, where the question is, what is courage? And Socrates is talking to a couple of generals who, as you might guess, are a little bit embarrassed that they can't give an account of courage. And the dialogue seems to end, as many dialogues do, with an admission of ignorance. I guess we really don't know what courage is. We're going to have to keep talking about this. Now, that reminded me of the Talmud, or rather the Talmud reminded me of those dialogues, because what you get is a kind of colloquy, a discussion, a conversation between, hundreds of, if you look over the whole Talmud, which, by the way, I'm not an expert in the whole Talmud. I certainly haven't read the whole Talmud, but you have hundreds of rabbis debating and discussing all kinds of issues. And they move, and by the way, this is also characteristic of the Platonic dialogues, from the most sort of immediate practical questions, right, to the most abstract and kind of eternal questions. Mm-hmm. The Platonic dialogues do that too, because they all sort of start out on a very basic level with a practical concern. And then philosophy grows out of the questions that are presented to you in practice, right? So, I mean, in the Talmud, it might be a case where your neighbor's tomatoes are leaning over onto your land, and can you pick them, and so forth. And then this kind of, you can sort of on a dime, you can turn on a dime into some kind of metaphysical discussion about the Almighty and so forth. So having noticed this, I mentioned it to some people. Jacob Neusner, the sort of great Talmud scholar, was visiting, and I said, gosh, there's this similarity. He says, oh, you should write a book on it. Right. And I thought, wow, that's a bridge too far. And then we had Rabbi Irving Greenberg in, and he told me the same thing. And I thought, well, why not? And once I got into it, I began to rethink what I had read in Leo Strauss. Okay, so of course, Leo Strauss, the great German Jew who came to the United States in the 30s, and single-handedly, I would say, produced the discipline of political theory in the United States by bringing a method of reading texts very closely and trying to understand, the author's perspective in the most charitable and generous way. Strauss argued that that the philosophical tradition and the religious tradition, and in particular Judaism, are radically incompatible, right? He says, look, they're incompatible in their conceptions of wisdom and in how to achieve it, right? So the beginning, he says, of wisdom for the Jew is fear of the Lord and love of God. And the beginning for philosophy is love of the good, right? Love of truth. The objects of wisdom are different too, because in Greek philosophy, the Greeks are very interested in distinguishing between what they call nomos, law, sort of conventional law that you might find, custom, unwritten custom, written law in a particular city, and nature, right? And nature is not simply scientific nature, but a kind of the sort of natural order of the universe, right? And Strauss points out that the beginning of philosophy really is wonder, and it pursues a kind of autonomous understanding that human beings can come to the truth through their own rational reflection. Whereas in Judaism, the emphasis is on obedience and humility.
Revelation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, what I realized, and I'll stop here and see if you have any thoughts about what I've said so far, is that the picture changes if you consider not the Bible and Greek philosophy, and here I should say, the way Strauss terms it is Athens and Jerusalem, right? That the tension between Athens and Jerusalem, which incidentally he saw as a kind of spring, a kind of energizing tension that's at the heart of Western civilization, and I think that's right. The picture changes if you don't think of Athens and Jerusalem, Bible and Greek philosophy in general, but rather Plato and the Talmud. Okay. So as I started to think about this, I realized here are some connections. This can be sort of a long list, but let me mention some of them. Both of these texts focus on questions and not on answers. They both are full of sort of paradoxes and inconsistencies, right? And contradictions, and that's often the beginning point, as you know, in Talmudic discussion. Is well, there seems to be a contradiction here. Let's see if we can resolve this. Both of them end up in a kind of open-ended way. Very often, these sugyot, these Talmudic discussions don't come to a definitive answer, right? And they present a range of opinions. So, for example, in the dialogue, you might have Socrates talking with, in the beginning of the Republic, Thrasymachus, who argues that, justice is simply the interest of the stronger, and Socrates has a much sort of moral perspective, and then maybe someone else has another perspective. And it's the reader who has to sort this out and decide where he or she is going to stand, right? Which of these perspectives are you going to embrace? Another thing I have to say is that, the dialogues, there's been some argument, and I don't take a stance on this, that the Platonic dialogues, which, as I said earlier, are philosophical dramas, were actually performed, okay? And I mention that because they invite reading in a group, right? I mean, when you read a dialogue, the best way to do it is to sit and talk with other people and kind of discuss these perspectives. And obviously, Talmud is meant to be studied in a group. So going beyond this now, so those are kind of formal similarities, but let's look at sort of the content. What's at stake in the Talmud, ultimately? Well, one of the fundamental issues is how we should live, right? How to live. And, for example, what it means to live according to the law of God, right? When you apply that to the particulars of your existence. The same thing is true in the Platonic dialogues. The question of the best life, the good life, the just life is front and center. And both the Talmud and the dialogues are focused on law. Now, law has a different meaning in the Greek context because it's not revealed law, and morality, right? And the point of these texts is always to unite study and action, intellectual and moral virtue. It's not simply to be a scholar. It's not simply to have the best understanding of the Torah, right? You have to live Torah.
It has to translate.
It has to translate into your life. It has to be, let me put it this way. One of the issues is, how do you internalize it? How do you take it into your soul? And how does it become an animating principle of your life, right? And so it's also the case with Socrates. You know, the active and contemplative lives are inseparable. Socrates, so Plato had this this doctrine, if you will, of the ideas. So what are the ideas? The ideas are the eternal being and truth of a thing, right? So the idea of justice is kind of this sort of pure concept of justice that one could either live up to or fail to live up to. And Socrates is constantly trying to live up to the ideas. And that requires two things, right? It requires trying to intellectually cognize the ideas, to understand them, to know them. Now, this is unfortunately a process that one can never be certain about, right? So Socrates is constantly inquiring, but he always has humility. He's always ready to say, here's the way I look at this, but if someone else has a better idea, I'm ready to learn from you. So there is doubt on the way up to the idea, right? You know, and we might compare that to, have we understood Torah correctly, right? Have we understood what this means, what this book means? And then it's not just that, you got to bring it down into your life. And that, of course, is a very interesting problem, because the way the Greeks would frame that is, to bring what you know into your life requires practical wisdom, requires sound judgment. There's no, in any given circumstance in life, there's no cheating. There's no app that says, like the Justice app, you know, right? You push it and says, do this or do that, right? You got to have that. And the problem is, and I think I think the Talmud understands this, that cannot be systematically formulated, right? There's no sort of guidebook, right? As much as the greatest minds in the world have thought about these, there's no guidebook that tells you what you need to do right now in this particular context, in this situation. Rather, there is a kind of ethos, right? A kind of, Eliezer Berkovitz calls it the halakhic conscience. And another rabbi named Max Kadushin, who I talk about in the book, talks about the value concepts of Rabbinic Judaism. This is sort of living Torah, but you can't say, right? You can't formulate in some kind of systematic way the knowledge that is involved in living up to Torah, living up to the law, but you can show it, and you can show it mimetically. You can show it through aggadah narrative. You can show it in the Platonic dialogues, through these dramas about Socrates. And let's just take Socrates. We see him speaking, we see him acting, we see him defying the command of the Athenians in the case brought against him to stop philosophizing. We see him in jail in a dialogue called the Crito, refusing to escape from jail.
Love that one.
Yeah.
One of my favorite ones.
Yeah. And so, you know, this itself provokes reflection. Why won't, you know, Socrates believes that he was unjustly convicted, but he's not going to escape from jail. And he has arguments because we have to obey the law, right? So this is a sort of interesting paradox.
The law is bigger than his life.
Yeah. The law is bigger than his life. Exactly. So what I realized is that in the narrative aggadah about the sages, and by the way, the reason I chose Ta'anit 3 is it's loaded with great stories.
Yeah.
Lots of different sages who are approaching the same matters, often in, you know, sort of diametrically opposed ways. Is that these stories show what it means not just to think like a sage, right? Which we get with, say, halakhic disputation and so forth. But what it means to be a sage, what it means to live like a sage. Now, here's another thought going even deeper. I realized that the dialogues and the Talmud are ultimately responses to something like civilizational crisis, okay? So let's just take the Platonic dialogues. Here's Plato. He's born in around 428 BCE, near the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. The war goes on. It's a war between Athens and her allies and Sparta. They're called the Peloponnesians. 404 BC, the Spartans are finally victorious. And they set up a puppet government in Athens. And unfortunately, by the way, run by some of Plato's relatives.
Oh.
That's a whole interesting story, because Plato was invited to join the regime. And then he said, I thought they were going to restore the city to justice and so forth. And incidentally, his view was that the Athenian democracy, which was a direct democracy, and kind of, he regarded that regime as having made tremendous mistakes, as having been greedy for wealth and power. And the people were like, yes, let's do crazy things like send our whole navy over to Sicily and conquer these cities, and we'll do all this. And they failed miserably. And Plato had a kind of aristocratic attitude, and he thought, no, we got to have, an aristocratic regime and restore it to the city to its health. And then he realized, he writes in a famous document called the Seventh Letter, then I realized that the old regime was a thing of gold compared to this one, right? And he withdrew. Those guys persecuted Socrates. They forbid him to philosophize. And then ultimately, when they were overthrown, this group of oligarchs known as the 30 Tyrants, Socrates was prosecuted by the restored democracy for various reasons that I won't go into. And then so Plato's teacher is then put to death. And by the way, all the students of Plato regarded him as the most just, the most truthful, the most brilliant man, they had ever met. Xenophon, another student of Socrates, talks about him this way. And so, if I had been Plato, I thought about this, I would probably just, become a complete cynic and a nihilist and, retreat and but his response is, I'm going to write 35 dialogues. I'm going to write 35 dialogues, and those dialogues are going to be focused on Socrates and the life of Socrates. They're going to be focused on the past. So he's writing now in the 4th century from Socrates is executed in 399, and then Plato writes for the next 30, 40 years. And they're going to sort of revive this world before it collapsed, before the city of Athens lost its autonomy, before the great Socrates was killed, before the end of everything great. The 5th century had Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides and Themistocles and Thucydides and Pericles and and Socrates and so forth. That was all swept away. That was the kind of golden age swept away. So what's he doing? He wants us to internalize the past. He wants us what he does is he produces a curriculum, a new curriculum for a broken age, right? And sort of single-handedly, I don't know if there was success in Athens exactly, although Plato did teach Aristotle. And then Aristotle, by the way, had a very famous student who did not become a philosopher. That was Alexander the Great. So, things kind of went awry a little bit there. But to produce a curriculum in the examined life that would restore some kind of health to the city of Athens. Talmud is even greater success, right? So the destruction of the Second Temple, no locus of contact with God, no priests, no sacrifice,
no prophets.
No prophets. What are you going to do? And Rabbinic Judaism is reborn, and it is reborn, as we know, right? We get the Mishnah, we get the Gemara, and those texts. I mean, the Babylonian Talmud, 2.5 million words, right? The Jerusalem Talmud, what is it, 1 million words, something like this? These, I contend, are also curricula to form. These are formative texts that are trying to establish attitudes and virtues in the souls of their readers, and to orient them toward health and justice and goodness. and to produce flourishing communities and so forth. So I think that there's a sense of, I've always, to me, the rabbinic response to Judaism, like the rabbinic response to the crisis of the Second Temple, is the most evident proof of the fecundity, the fruitfulness of the Jewish tradition. To be able to look at a world and say, our world has collapsed, it is fractured, the things we depended on are gone. Now what are we going to do? There's a guy named Rosenstock Hussey, who is 20th century intellectual, and he said something like, a citizen is a person who, if the need arises, can reinvent civilization, right? Like that's the highest level. And I think Plato and the rabbis engaged in exactly that kind of reinvention. Right? So this is extremely interesting. Now, let me go a little further here. The dialogues in the Talmud and the Talmud look to the past, but they present new models, new kinds of heroes, right? So, there's a tractate, there's a little story in Talmud where Joshua, and maybe more than one story, who's the great military hero, right, is represented as kind of, a yeshiva bacher. He's kind of turned into this
Yes.
student of Torah. So we had our Joshuas, we had our patriarchs. We had these are very successful people. Abraham, he's a warrior. He knows how to make money. He's got it all, right? Now the new hero is the rabbi. In the Greek tradition, who are the heroes? Achilles, the warriors, right? He's the top. Socrates in the Apology, which is the dialogue of his trial, implicitly compares himself. He explicitly compares himself to Achilles. He's a new Achilles. What kind of warrior is he? He's a philosophical warrior, right? So that's very interesting. And then what I really realized, and this has to do now with my study of Plato, is that there is a sense, to use Strauss's terms, in which Athens can be found at the heart of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem can be found at the heart of Athens. Now, what do I mean by that? The Talmud and the Platonic dialogues express a certain tension between rational inquiry and faith, right? Or between what can be known through rational discussion and so forth, and these mysteries that are sort of beyond the ken of those who are engaging in this rational inquiry. There's a great book by Menachem Fish called Rational Rabbis. And in fact, it's funny because his introduction is like 40 pages long. He's comparing the Talmudic rabbis. He's talking about Karl Popper. Karl Popper was a logician, a philosopher of science, right? Who sort of developed this idea of falsifiability. Popper's claim is that you can't prove a theory. Like, let's say, you can't prove the law of gravity. You can formulate the law of gravity. And then you can conduct experiments that would falsify your understanding of the law of gravity. So, for example, the law of gravity indicates that, if I let go of this pen, it's going to fall, right? Well, that did not falsify my little experiment. If you're listening on the podcast, I dropped the pen and it fell into my hand. So far, the law of gravity has not been falsified. So Popper lays out a kind of whole method of scientific inquiry. And Menachem Fish, in his book on Rational Rabbis, suggests that the rabbis are essentially sort of Popperian inquirers, right? Who sort of formulate hypotheses, and then they see if they can explain the evidence. And then if they find evidence that falsifies it, they change the hypotheses. So we know that the Talmudic rabbis are rational. What about Socrates? Now, here's something I take seriously. And there is a school of thought of certainly some Straussians that thinks it's all ironic and so forth. But if you read the Apology, Socrates tells the following story. How did I begin philosophizing? Well, I had a friend, and the friend went to the Oracle of Delphi. Now, what is an oracle? An oracle is a location where the gods speak, right? And it's a temple, usually, right? And there are priestesses in the case of Delphi, and they interpret certain signs, and they tell you what the god's answer is. So his friend Chaerephon goes to the oracle, and he asks the oracle, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle answers with the shortest revelation, I want to say, in history. And the answer is no. And here's what Socrates says. He says, this really puzzled me, because I look into my soul and I say, I'm not wise, right? But, and here's the faith part, I know that the oracle cannot have uttered a falsehood. Here's his principle. His principle is the gods, why can't they utter a falsehood? Because either that would mean they're ignorant, and the gods are not ignorant, or they're liars, and the gods are not liars. Now, let me pause here for a second. In the Greek tradition, in the Iliad, for example, in the Odyssey, the gods lie all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. They take on different shapes. They're totally undependable. They will lie, for example, to get revenge on somebody they want to see, come to grief. But here's Socrates, and he has this notion: no, it's not sanctioned for the gods to utter falsehoods. So I have to take this seriously. Is there an argument? No. He just asserts it. By the way, in other
goes against his general principles, not furthering the idea, just kind of, yeah, that's it. Got to take it seriously.
Got to take it
seriously. You don't find it anywhere in Socrates besides there.
Yeah, exactly. So there it is. And he says, so then I thought, well, you know what I'm going to do? And this is very interesting. I'm going to go find someone who's wiser than me. And I'm going to bring him back to the oracle. And I'm going to say, you told me that I was the wisest, but this guy's wiser. Now, incidentally, some people have said this shows he's irreligious, right? Because he wants to show that the gods have lied or that they're ignorant. On the contrary, Socrates wants to engage in a Socratic conversation with the gods. This is another connection with Talmud, incidentally. I mean, one of the great things about Talmud are the interactions between God and human beings.
Yeah,
it's just amazing. And by the way, God has a sense of humor, which is fantastic.
Totally.
It's absolutely fantastic. So, and it's really lovely. And in fact, we see, for example, in the Oven of Akhnai story, which I might talk about later, there's a point at which a rabbi stands up to God and says, by the way, you don't really have a role in this conversation, right? You have spoken, but let us sort this out, right? Which is really, you might say almost, it's impertinent, So that's one of the cool things. So then I realized, like, okay, if this is correct, then the greatest Socrates is regarded as one of, if not the greatest philosophers in history, right? Certainly the first philosopher, as Cicero writes, to bring philosophy down from the heavens, because before Socrates, by the way, they have what were called pre-Socratic philosophers, and their questions were very like, where did everything come from? Did it come from water? Did it come from fire? What are things made of? And sort of physical, physicist questions. Socrates brought philosophy down, started inquiring about good and bad and just and unjust and so forth, brought it into the cities of men, as Cicero says. So here's this original philosopher, and his philosophizing is rooted in faith. I forgot to finish the story. He goes around and he starts talking to people, and he realizes these guys don't know what they're talking about, because they think they're wise, but they're not. So I am wiser just by this little bit, because I know I'm not wise. But it's that oracle at Delphi sets him off on his life, which is really, you could sum it up as an attempt to understand what is wisdom and who is Socrates, who am I, and what does it mean to be wise? And so yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the Oracle of Delphi, I remember my first dialogue that I read from Plato was Apology. My Rabbi Maruf, I said I wanted to learn Plato, and he's like, if you're going to learn Plato, you got to start with Apology. It's sort of an intro, as you just mentioned, right? It really sets up all the rest of the dialogues in terms of, his motivation and what is wisdom and all that. And I remember I got up to the Delphi Oracle, and I was completely shocked. I was I'm like, what? Like, huh? It kind of came out of nowhere, and especially for a new reader. So you bringing that in, it brought me back to when I first read it and how surprised I was at that. And I thought it was maybe sarcastic. I thought maybe it's like, I didn't know what to do with it at the time. It was sort of like, whoa, you know what I mean? Like, how did we get to this spiritual event, right? With Socrates the philosopher, and you just brought that up. So the whole thing just kind of, when I replayed it in my mind when you were talking about that, and you were mentioning, so you're using that to show that there's a spiritual element, right? There is a Jerusalem element, right? That is really like the catalyst and the force behind everything that Socrates advanced.
Yeah, I really like your telling me that story about reading the Apology, Ben-Zion, because it's funny. I mean, I've taught the Apology a million times, and students don't really notice that, right?
Oh,
but
I sat for a good 5 minutes. I was like, wait,
yeah, which is absolutely great, because so I mean, here I am, I'm sort of saturated in Greek philosophy. I read Talmud, I'm like, what's going on here, right? And then you're saturated, obviously, a lot more Talmud than I know, I'm sure, and you come from the religious background, you're really saying, what's going on here, right? So this is really interesting. Let me say a little bit more about this too. It's not the only place. So Socrates was actually put on trial in part because he kept talking about this, what he called daimonion. So a daimon, sometimes it's translated in English demon, but that gives a kind of negative, right? Because we look like demons, there's, haunted and so forth. But really, it's a word that means like a sort of intermediate deity, a kind of let's say a lesser god that communicates to human beings, but it's a divine voice. And Socrates talks about his divine voice. In fact, he talks about it in the Apology. He says, once he's convicted and sentenced to death, he says, actually, this wasn't so bad, because my daimonion, my little divine voice, hasn't spoken to me at this time. And because usually it talks to me if something's going wrong, right? And it didn't.
Right.
Also, there's a dialogue called the Theaetetus, where Socrates is talking to a young man named Theaetetus, and Socrates explains his unusual activity of like, what do I do as a philosopher? And he compares himself to a midwife of souls. I talk to people and I help them to give birth to some understanding, right? I sort of tease it out of them. Young people are pregnant with ideas, but they don't know how to articulate them, and I help them to do that. And he says, the God has commanded me to do that, right? Now, again, there's so many places in the dialogues where we hear this kind of stuff that it would be foolish, frankly, to rule them out. One has to begin by taking them seriously. And I began that way and never ended, right? I continue to take it seriously. Here's a little problem, though. In the Jewish tradition, we know who God is. We learn from the beginning, the first words of the Bible. We get the whole story, and then we get all the way into Exodus, and then finally we have the giving of the law and so forth. But but God has established God's bona fides, right? Like, why should you listen to this law, right? Well, I'm the guy who created the universe and so forth. Socrates is very interesting, and I don't know if you noticed this, Ben-Zion, in the Apology, he never names the God.
True.
Now, some people say, well, it's Apollo, because the Oracle of Delphi is the Oracle of Apollo, the Temple of Apollo. But in the Republic, he talks about, and this is also a part of his effort to sort of clean up Greek religion. There's, in the end of the second book of the Republic, he lays down some theological principles. In fact, the very first occurrence in history, as far as we know, of the word theologia, which literally means speech about the gods, occurs in the Republic. Socrates says, let me give you a theologia, if you will, right? And he lays out certain principles. The gods don't lie. They don't change shape. We already saw that from the Apology, right? And so he lays this out. But what happens in that context and elsewhere is he switches from singular to plural. The God, the gods. Why does he do this? My own intuition is because he doesn't know whether they're one or many. What does he know about the gods? You see, you could read Homer and you know it's polytheism and you get their names and so forth. But by the way, the Greek historian Herodotus very tellingly writes at one point, you know, we didn't even know who the gods were or what they did until Homer told us 400 years ago, right? Which is sort of a way of saying like they're made up, you know. I mean, one can interpret it that way. But Socrates is a humble man. He doesn't know. But look at it. He doesn't know if there's one God or many, but he knows they don't lie. They tell the truth. And when they speak, you better listen to them.
He knows what the characteristic of a God should be.
Yes.
In our minds. That doesn't mean that he knows God or that he can speak of the God, but he could speak of the gods in terms of what should be their characteristics.
Yes, and one could sort of put it this way, right? Without further information, because this, of course, is the massive difference between the Greek tradition and the Hebraic tradition. There's no revelation, right? You're in the dark. So how does Socrates proceed? You might sort of put it this way: what kind of being is worthy to be worshipped?
Exactly.
Now, not, by the way, gods who lie or steal or commit adultery and all these horrible things that the Greek gods do, but gods who are good and just. And in fact, Socrates presents them almost as models for the philosophical life, right? To be a god is to do what is right because it is right, right? In other words, they're governed by reason, you know? And in this dialogue, Euthyphro, we might talk about, it's a discussion on piety. And Socrates basically says, is something pious just because God says it is?
Right. Yes.
Which is a kind of voluntarism, right? In other words, the will of God makes something pious, right? So what do we mean by piety in Greek religion? Well, if we just look at the myths and the stories, if Zeus tells you to do something, you better do it. Why? Because Zeus said it. I often put it this way: Zeus is a godfather, right? He's often, by the way, he's often referred to as the father. He's a godfather, right? Now, that perspective is not a very humane one. It doesn't sort of say a lot about human dignity, right? Why should I do this? Because Zeus said so. And incidentally, that's what Greek prophecy is too. The Greek diviners, they'll cut open an animal or look at how a bird flies, or they have various techniques. And they tell you, for example, before a battle, every time the Greeks were going to fight a battle, they'd have their diviner come out. And they look and like, uh-oh, the kidney's too big or something, right? Whatever the technique is. We shouldn't fight today. It's not auspicious. The gods are not behind us. And you don't question it. Socrates hates this. Is something pious because the god says it is? Or does the god say something is pious because it's pious, right?
Which is the exact, we can locate the exact argument regarding mitzvot, commandments. That's the exact argument where Maimonides would vehemently suggest that it is a mitzvah is to be done because it is correct to do it, not just because it was commanded, but it was commanded because there's a rational basis for it to be commanded to us.
Yeah, and this is really important today. I mean, the former Pope Benedict died recently, and there's been some good articles about him, and he was a voice within the Catholic tradition of reason. In particular, he had strong criticisms of Islam because much of Islam anyway, or much of the Islamic world, it's very voluntaristic, right? I mean, you
have to submit to the will of God and no questioning.
Exactly. And there are also versions within Christianity. I mean, I long ago made the connection between Calvinism and Islam. Calvin teaches that there's a doctrine of double predestination. From eternity, God has, for God's own reasons, decided that a few human beings will be saved and the vast majority will be damned, right? And that's just the way it is. And we don't know why. I mean, that's just, so this is complete kind of voluntarism. Incidentally, I would say willfulness is a huge problem in the world today. And those like Maimonides and others who wish to restore at Benedict an understanding of reason, right, of our rational capabilities to grasp what God has commanded, or this is extremely important. So let me say one last thing about the connection, and then we can maybe talk about some specifics in the Talmud. Another thing I noticed, and that is that it looks to me like, and we can debate and discuss this, it looks to me like the Talmud is what Leo Strauss would call, or that the Talmud as a text incorporates what Leo Strauss would call esotericism. Let me explain by that. So esotericism, from the Straussian point of view, is saying different things to different audiences. Okay. And it's gotten a bad reputation because the critics want to see it as like a secret teaching that's available only to a select few who understand what the author is really doing beneath the surface. But that's not it at all. I would suggest it's a recognition that different audiences have different needs and need to be met at different places. We all practice esotericism, you know, in the sense that we tailor what we say to the person we're speaking to and to the occasion. Sort of silly example, right? But let's say you have a great aunt who loves to wear ugly hats, and she comes in with her ugly hat and she asks you if her hat looks good. Well, what do you say? You know, you don't say, you know, Aunt Shelley, let me just lay it on the line here. You've always worn ugly hats and so forth. No, you don't do that, right? Now, in what sense would, and I'll set aside the Platonic docs, but in what sense would the Talmud be esoteric? Because it connects, and this is a very interesting question, it has both a traditionalist level and a kind of anti-traditionalist level. So the traditionalist level is God gave the oral law to Moses at Sinai, and what we're trying to do at this late date is to reconstruct what that law was, right? It's sort of gotten corrupted over the years. My example is somebody gives you a full bowl brimming of water and you hand it to the next day, some water spills out and so forth, you keep passing it down. And that's the source of the debates between the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai and so forth. And we're reconstructing what we know is authoritative and true because it was given to Moses by God. Or maybe it's possible for there to be new understandings and new insights as we move forward. And there's a kind of anti-traditionalist strain in the Talmud as well, where it's suggested that, you know, the road from Sinai isn't completely paved, but we can sort of extend it further. And so I see this as a kind of way of giving readers what they need, right? And by the way, the Talmud doesn't decide this question. It just presents two perspectives.
Correct.
So that's, I think, an interesting thing. Go ahead.
Interesting because so the Gaonic view, the Gaonim, right? They took the former and said it was basically there was stuff that got corrupted and to reconstruct. Maimonides, though, believes that essential within Moses giving over the oral law was also certain principles that the rabbis with authority can actually create new with. They can create new laws. I want to say there are details in the laws, maybe new laws is the wrong word, but there are details, let's say unexplained details, right, that are kind of left to the sages to, by using certain methodology, Kal v'chomer, klal u'prat, prat u'klal, using those given principles, they can actually create a new, and that's actually meant to be. So it's kind of both sides of the coin are actually being played out over there, right? That there's that tradition that got kind of maybe somewhat corrupted that needs to be reconstructed. But along with that, right, Maimonides also inserts the fact that, yeah, the rabbis did have certain authority to fill in details, right, or even create new customs or whatnot based on, you know, their times. So that's just interesting because there's actually a little playoff that goes on, you know, based off of what you said between the Gonim and the Rambam.
Yeah, and you know, what's interesting too is that, so here's another comparison with Socrates. You know, he is accused of the actual charges that were brought against him at his trial were not acknowledging the gods of Athens, the Greek word is nomidzein. It means like customarily acknowledging, like not in accordance with custom, acknowledging the gods in the customary way, but introducing new deities. Okay. Now, I already pointed out he's critical of the Greek gods, right? And he presents a picture of the gods that's quite different from what you read in Homer, for example. But there's another sense in which Socrates is super traditional. So in Homer, there's a fundamental contradiction. If you read the Odyssey, there's a passage, so Odysseus has gone home and he's in disguise and he's being mistreated by the men who have invaded his house and are trying to marry his wife. And there's a discussion about, somebody says, and he's dressed as a beggar, and one of these suitors of his wife, there's 108 of them in the house, has like thrown a stool at him and they're berating Odysseus. They don't know it's Odysseus. And somebody says, don't you know that the gods wander through the cities of men, observing our deeds and seeing whether we're just or unjust? And in fact, ultimately justice is done. And with the aid of Athena, Odysseus defeats the suitors. He kills them all. And he achieves victory. And we see this elsewhere in the Greek myths, that we got these two contradictory views. Zeus commits, you know, all kinds of crimes and adultery and so forth, but he's also an agent of justice. Well, Socrates grabs onto that. Gods are agents of justice. He holds to the idea, the customary ideals of filial piety, right? You respect your fathers, you respect, and by the way, of course, there's this idea of fundamental respect for law. And so, you know, and as I said, he believes that what the oracle said, that the oracle is a site of contact with the divine. So there's a kind of interesting tension between these things. And I think that's another point of connection with the Talmud.
Wonderful
Amazing
segment.